The night of the party was supposed to be just another memory to tuck away, a story we'd laugh about in a few years when life got more complicated. Jean, Rose, Abby, Jacob, Ryan, and I had been friends for what felt like forever. That kind of friendship where silence doesn't feel awkward, and no matter how much time passes, nothing changes. But the party itself was uneventful, at least as far as high school parties go. Drinks flowed, music blared, and someone inevitably started crying over a breakup. By the end of it, we were all tired but still buzzing from the fun. Piling into my car, I took the driver's seat. It was my car, after all, and I wasn't about to let someone else take the wheel, even if I'd had a drink or two. Ryan sat up front with me, his little brother energy as obnoxious as ever. The others squeezed into the back seat, Rose practically sitting on Jacob's lap while Jean and Abby squabbled over space. The road home was supposed to take 10 minutes. It took an hour before any of us realized something was wrong. The first sign was how the roads stretched longer than they should have. A few turns became endless stretches of asphalt winding through unfamiliar territory. "Fred, are you sure this is the right way?" Jacob asked from the back. His voice was calm but edged with something nervous. "Of course it is," I snapped, though doubt had already started to creep in. The scenery outside the windows didn't look right. Trees loomed too tall, their shadows twisting into unnatural shapes. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on the car like we were driving underwater. When the mansion appeared on the horizon, it felt like a mirage. It stood alone in a clearing, grand and imposing, with ivy crawling up its stone walls. A massive gate hung open as if it had been expecting us. "That's weird," Abby muttered. "We're not staying here," I said immediately. "Come on, Fred," Ryan countered, rolling his eyes. "What's the big deal? It's late. We're all tired. Let's just crash here for the night." I looked at the others, expecting backup, but they were already swayed by the mansion's allure. Even Rose, who always had my back, shrugged. "It's just for the night," she said. "It's not like we're breaking in. It looks abandoned anyway." For a split second, the mansion shifted before my eyes. Its grand stone exterior flickered, replaced by the rotting facade of an old hospital. Broken windows, peeling paint. The air around it seemed to hum with decay. I blinked, and it was a mansion again. "Fred, you okay?" Rose's voice broke through my trance. I shook my head. "This isn't right. Let's just keep driving." But I was outvoted. Inside, the mansion was straight out of a movie. High ceilings, polished wooden floors, and a chandelier that looked like it was worth more than my car. Dust coated everything, but it only added to the charm. "This place is amazing," Jean said, spinning around like she was in a fairy tale. "Creepy," I muttered under my breath. We found the reception desk and divided into 2 rooms, one for the guys and one for the girls. No one questioned the convenience of the neatly made beds waiting for us. That night, as the others drifted off, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't just the strange ride or the flickering facade of the mansion that had me on edge. It was the sound, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the hallway. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination or some animal scurrying around. But the longer I listened, the louder it got. I nudged Jacob. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and turned over. "Go to sleep, man. You're paranoid." The sound didn't stop. I couldn't take it anymore. Slipping out of bed, I grabbed my phone for light and crept into the hallway. The mansion was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive. The air was thick, the smell of rot faint but present. The further I walked, the less the mansion looked like the elegant estate we'd entered. The walls became grimy, the wallpaper peeling to reveal cracked plaster. The polished floorboards gave way to scuffed tiles, and the air grew colder. By the time I reached the end of the hallway, I was no longer in a mansion. I was in a hospital. The scratching led me to a door slightly ajar. Through the crack, I saw them. 3 figures in blood, stained coats huddled around a man strapped to a gurney. Their hands moved methodically, pulling organs from his body like mechanics working on a car. The man was still alive. His eyes rolled in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. I froze, unable to breathe. One of the figures turned its head slowly, unnaturally, until its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The others followed, their heads rotating a full 360 degrees. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. But before I could move, the first figure was in front of me. Its face was inches from mine, its hollow eyes burning into me. "You're next," it whispered. I ran. The hallway twisted and stretched, doors slamming shut as I passed. Footsteps echoed behind me, closing in no matter how fast I moved. When I reached a dead end, I turned to see her. A woman in a tattered patient's gown stood there, her smile impossibly wide, her hair hung in tangled clumps, and her hollow eyes sparkled with malice. Behind her, a crowd of twisted figures stared at me, their forms half hidden in shadow. She raised a hand and pointed at me. "You're next." I didn't have time to scream before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed, drenched in sweat. The others teased me about my bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a dream at all. As we left the mansion the next morning, I glanced back one last time. It wasn't there. But at the edge of the clearing, waving goodbye, was the woman from the night before. Her smile was wider than ever. For the first few days after the mansion or hospital or whatever that place was, I managed to convince myself it was all in my head. It wasn't easy. I was jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. Little things, like a shadow in the corner of my vision or the faint creak of a floorboard, would send my heart racing. The others brushed it off. Abby joked that I was spooked from drinking too much. Jean and Jacob laughed along, and even Rose, who normally took my side, seemed eager to let it go. But I couldn't forget. Not the woman, not her smile, not her words. "You're next." The first real crack in the illusion came on a Wednesday. School was the same as always, classes I didn't care about, teachers droning on, and friends making plans for the weekend. It wasn't until lunch that I noticed something was off. Rose hadn't shown up. She texted me earlier, Jacob said, shrugging it off. Said she wasn't feeling great, probably just a stomach bug. I nodded, but something about it didn't sit right. Later that night, I texted her, "Mitt, you okay? Everyone was worried about you today." She didn't reply. By Friday, Rose still wasn't at school. Jacob looked worried, but he tried to play it cool. "She's probably just sick," he said, but his voice wavered. That afternoon, I decided to stop by her house. When I got there, her mom was on the porch, her face pale and drawn. "She's been in her room all week," she said, her voice shaking. "She won't eat. She barely talks. It's like she's not herself." I knocked on Rose's door and let myself in when she didn't answer. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Rose was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. "Rose," I said softly. She didn't move. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw a notebook clutched in her hands, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "What's that?" I asked. She looked up at me then, her eyes sunken and bloodshot. "I see them," she whispered. The notebook was filled with frantic scribbles, page after page of disturbing drawings. Figures in hospital gowns, their faces twisted and grotesque. A woman with hollow eyes and a gaping smile. And over again the words, "They're watching. They were there," Rose said, her voice trembling. "At the mansion. Watching us the whole time. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." She pointed to a sketch of the dining table we'd sat at that night. At first, it looked normal, until I noticed the faint outlines of shadowy figures standing behind each chair. "What is this?" I asked, my stomach churning. She grabbed my arm, her grip cold and desperate. "Fred, we never should have stayed there. I keep seeing them in my dreams. It's like they're waiting for something." I didn't know what to say. The next day, Rose was gone. Her parents found her in the bathroom, wrist slit and the notebook soaked in blood. Her suicide note was short and haunting. "They won't let me go." The news shattered our group. Jean cried for hours, clinging to Abby while Jacob sat in stunned silence. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered over and over. She was fine. She was happy. But she hadn't been. Not since that night. Jacob's spiral began shortly after the funeral. He became obsessed with Rose's death, convinced it wasn't a suicide. He spent hours online, digging through forums and articles about strange phenomena. He barely slept, barely ate. "It's connected to that place," he told me one night. His eyes were wild, his voice shaking. "I'm going back." "Don't," I said firmly. "There's nothing there." But he didn't listen. Jacob drove out to where the mansion had been. He called me that night, his voice frantic. "It's gone," he said. "There's nothing here, just trees and dirt." "Good," I replied, relief flooding through me. "No, leave it alone, Jake." But he didn't. The next morning, they found his body in the community pool. The official cause of death was drowning, but something about it didn't sit right. The lifeguard who found him said his face was frozen in a look of pure terror, his hands clawing at his throat as if he'd been trying to pull something off. and there was something else. The night Jacob died, Abby swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of her driveway watching her house. A woman in a hospital gown, her hair matted and her mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin. By the time Jean died, I stopped believing in coincidence. She and Abby were driving back from a late-night study session when a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Jean swerved, crashing into a tree. Abby survived with minor injuries, but Jean didn't make it. When I visited Abby in the hospital, she told me what she saw. "It was a woman," she said, her voice shaky. "She was pregnant, Fred, and she was covered in blood." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she wasn't lying. The deaths weren't random. Something from that night was following us, taking us off one by one. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me. Abby moved in with me after Jean's death. Neither of us could stand to be alone anymore. Her parents were happy to let her stay. They thought it might help us heal, but there wasn't any healing to be done. Not with what we'd seen. The first night she stayed over, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Abby, but when I called her name, she didn't answer. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my door. "Abby," I whispered. No reply. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my hand trembling. The bulb flickered to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. I stared at the door, waiting for anything, to happen. But there was nothing. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The days blurred together. Abby and I spent hours digging through old newspaper archives and forums, trying to make sense of what was happening. We found countless stories of strange deaths and disappearances, all tied to a single location, the abandoned hospital. According to the records, the building had been a psychiatric facility in the early 1900s, but it was shut down after a string of gruesome murders. Patients and staff alike were found mutilated, their bodies arranged in macabre displays. The killer was never caught. Some locals believed the hospital was cursed, that the spirits of the dead lingered there, hungry for revenge. I didn't believe in curses. Not then. Abby started hearing things at night. It began with faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. Then came the tapping. "It's like someone's knocking on the walls," she told me, her voice shaking. "I can't sleep, Fred. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like someone's watching me." I tried to comfort her, but I didn't have the words. The truth was, I felt it too. One night, I woke to find Abby standing by the window staring out into the dark. "Abby," I said softly, sitting up in bed. She didn't respond. I climbed out of bed and approached her slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Abby," I repeated, placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to me then, her eyes wide and unblinking. "They're out there," she whispered. I followed her gaze to the street below. At first, I saw nothing but the empty road. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure standing beneath the street lamp, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move. The next morning, we packed our things and left town. We didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to escape. But no matter how far we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Everywhere we went, I saw them. Figures in hospital gowns, their hollow eyes watching us from the shadows. Abby saw them too. "They're not just following us," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting for something." Our search for answers led us to an old woman named Eleanor, a former patient at the hospital. We found her living in a rundown nursing home on the edge of town. When we mentioned the hospital, her face paled, and she clutched the edges of her blanket. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a place of pain and madness. Once you've entered, it never lets you go." She told us about the patients, the experiments, the screams that echoed through the halls at night. "They fed on us," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Or fear, or pain, it gave them strength." When Abby asked who they were, Eleanor's expression changed. Her gaze shifted to the doorway, her body tensing as if she'd seen a ghost. "That boy," she said, her voice rising in panic. "He's one of them." We turned to look, but the hallway was empty. That night, I confronted Ryan. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Fred, it's me. What's wrong with you?" But his words didn't comfort me. I couldn't shake the memory of Eleanor's face, the way she'd screamed when she saw him. And then there was the other thing. I couldn't remember Ryan ever being at the mansion. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Ryan wasn't real. Or at least, he wasn't human. He'd been with us every step of the way, but no one else had noticed. He'd wormed his way into our group, into our memories, like a parasite. And now, he was leading us back to the hospital. We had no choice but to go back. The hospital had its claws in us, pulling us closer with every breath, every step. Abby was the one who said it out loud, her voice trembling but resolute. "We have to end this, Fred. If we don't, we're next." I wanted to argue, to scream that going back was insane, but deep down, I knew she was right. The hospital wasn't going to let us go. Ryan was the one who suggested we drive. His sudden eagerness to return to the source of our nightmares set my teeth on edge. He smiled too easily, his eyes never quite meeting mine. But Abby didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. "We're sticking together this time," she said as we piled into the car. "No wandering off, no splitting up. If something happens, we leave." Agreed. Ryan just smiled. The drive to the hospital felt different this time. The roads were darker, quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Abby gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "It shouldn't be far now," she said, her voice brittle. But the miles stretched on, the scenery blurring into an endless expanse of shadows and trees. And then, like a terrible magic trick, the hospital appeared. It rose from the ground like a decayed tooth, its crumbling walls and broken windows framed by a sickly yellow light. Abby slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. For a moment, none of us spoke. "It's smaller than I remember," Ryan said, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You weren't here," I snapped. His smile faltered just for a moment before it returned. Guess I was mistaken. The air grew colder as we approached the entrance. The doors hung open, swaying gently in a breeze that carried the scent of decay. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the floors littered with broken glass and forgotten scraps of paper. "This place is a tomb," Abby whispered, her voice echoing down the empty hallway. Ryan chuckled softly. "It's just a building. What's the worst that could happen?" I shot him a glare, but he didn't seem to notice. We moved deeper into the hospital, the silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. The air grew heavier with each step, the shadows lengthening and twisting into shapes that made my stomach churn. We passed what had once been a waiting room, its chairs overturned and covered in dust. A rusted wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels squeaking faintly as if moved by an unseen hand. And then we heard it. The latter, it was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second. High-pitched and manic, it echoed through the halls, sending a shiver down my spine. "Who's there?" Abby called out, her voice trembling. The louder stopped. Ryan led the way, his steps sure and steady as if he'd been here before. "Why are you so calm?" I hissed, my fists clenched to my sides. He turned to me, his smile widening. "I'm not afraid of ghosts, Fred." Before I could respond, we reached the door to the operating room. It was the same door I'd seen in my dream. My stomach churned as memories of that night flooded back. Of the doctors, the patient, the blood. "It's locked," Abby said. Jiggling the handle, Ryan stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Let me try." Without hesitation, he pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The operating table sat in the center, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Instruments lay scattered across the floor, their edges glinting in the dim light. And then there was the figure in the corner. It stood motionless, its back to us, its body draped in a tattered hospital gown. "Hello," Abby whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. I froze. It was Rose. Or at least, it looked like her. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes wide and unblinking. Blood dripped from her mouth, staining the front of her gown. "Fred," she rasped, her voice distorted and guttural. Abby screamed. Ryan stepped forward, his smile gone. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "You've had your fun." But the figure tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Ryan turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to help," he said simply. Before I could respond, the figure lunged at him. Ryan didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand and the figure froze mid-air, its body convulsing as if caught in an invisible grip. "This isn't your fight," he said softly. And then, with a flick of his wrist, the figure vanished. Abby and I stared at him, our minds reeling. What the hell just happened? Abby demanded, her voice shaking. Ryan turned to us, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You wanted answers," he said, his voice calm. "Let's find them." Ryan's glowing eyes dimmed as he turned back to the operating room. Abby and I stood frozen, our breaths ragged in the choking air. "You knew," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You knew all along." Ryan looked at me, his face calm yet unreadable. "It's not as simple as you think, Fred," Abby explained. Abby snapped, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "What the hell is going on?" Ryan sighed, the weight of the moment seeming to press down on him. "This hospital doesn't just take people, it keeps them." The walls groaned as if reacting his words. "This placey." Ryan hesitated, glancing at the blood-stained floor. "It exists between life and death. It feeds on fear, on pain, on loss. The people it takes is, like Rose, like Jacob, aren't really gone. They're here somewhere. But they're not themselves anymore." My chest tightened. "What do you mean, not themselves?" Ryan's expression darkened. "They're puppets now, twisted by this place. You've seen them. The doctors, the nurses, the patients. They were all people once." Abby's knees buckled and she leaned against the wall for support. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, this can't be real." "It's real," Ryan said softly. "And it's not over." But before I could respond, the hospital itself seemed to come alive. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The air grew colder, and a deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through my bones. And then the voices started. They were faint at first, murmurs, whispers, but they grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Fred." I whipped around at the sound of my name, my heart pounding in my chest. "Fred, help me." It was Rose's voice. Without thinking, I bolted from the room, the sound of her voice pulling me deeper into the hospital. "Fred." Abby's voice echoed behind me, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, its walls pulsing as if alive. Doors slammed open and shut, revealing glimpses of horrors too grotesque to process. Faces twisted into unnatural shapes, bodies contorted in ways that defied logic. But I didn't care. All that mattered was Rose. I skidded to a halt in front of a door that seemed to call to me. It was different from the others. Larger, older, its surface etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Fred, wait." Abby's voice rang out as she caught up to me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Rose is in there," I said, my voice shaking. "Fred, don't." But it was too late. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast and empty, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected distorted versions of ourselves. In the center stood a single operating table, and on it lay Rose. Her body was motionless, her face pale and sunken. Tubes and wires snaked out of her skin, connecting her to a grotesque machine that pulsed with a sickly yellow light. "Rosie," I whispered, my throat tightening. Her eyes snapped open and she turned to look at me. "Fred," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "Help me." I rushed to her side, my hands shaking as I tried to free her from the machine. But as I touched the tubes, the mirrors shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered back on, revealing a crowd of figures surrounding us. They were the ghosts of the hospital, twisted, eyeless, grinning figures with hollow faces and grotesque smiles. At their center stood the woman from my dreams. She was even more horrifying up close, her face impossibly wide, her hair a tangled mess of black tendrils. She wore a tattered patient's gown, and her bony fingers twitched with unnatural energy. "You should have stayed away," she hissed, her voice echoing in my mind. I stepped in front of Rose, my hands balled into fists. "What do you want?" Her grin widened, her teeth sharp and glinting. "I want you to stay, all of you." The figures closed in, their laughter growing louder and more manic. "Fred, Fred," Abby screamed, her voice shaking with terror. I turned to her, my mind racing. "Get out of here. Find Ryan, go." "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you." "Abby, please." Before she could respond, the woman lunged at us, her movements unnaturally fast. I pushed Abby out of the way, bracing myself for the impact. But instead of attacking, the woman stopped inches from my face, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You belong to me now," she whispered. A sudden explosion of light filled the room, blinding us all. When the light faded, Ryan stood in the doorway, his eyes glowing with an intensity I'd never seen before. "Enough," he said, his voice booming with authority. The woman hissed, recoiling from the light. "You can't stop me," she snarled. Ryan stepped forward, his glow intensifying. "No, but I can delay you." The room began to shake violently, the walls cracking and splintering as the hospital itself seemed to collapse. "Fred, go!" Ryan shouted, his voice straining with effort. I hesitated, torn between staying and leaving. "Go," he screamed. Grabbing Abby's hand, I ran, pulling her through the crumbling hallways as the hospital fell apart around us. We burst through the front doors, just as the building collapsed, its twisted remains swallowed by the ground. For a moment there was silence. Then, from the rubble, a faint whisper. "I'll be waiting." Abby and I never spoke about what happened that night. We left town shortly after, cutting ties with everything and everyone we knew. But the memories never left me. Sometimes late at night, I hear the laughter again, and in the reflection of my mirror I see her, grinning, waiting, biding her time. I know one day she'll come for me, and when she does, I won't run.